JD Vance's speech has created considerable discussion, those outraged and those in support. Today I'm joined by Paul Embery, trade unionist and right-hand political commentator, to talk more about the controversy surrounding this speech. Welcome, Paul.
Hello again.
So you've written about this speech as well. Can you tell us your reactions to it?
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting speech, actually. I mean, look, I'm certainly not a supporter of Donald Trump. I'm not a supporter of the US Republican Party. I wouldn't vote Republican. If I were an American citizen, I wouldn't have voted for Trump. But JD Vance, I think, is an interesting character with some useful things to say. He's got an interesting background, of course. He comes from a genuine working class background, actually quite a disadvantaged background. Came from a broken home. He later joined the Marines in a non-combat role. And served in Iraq in that capacity, then went to law school before going into, I think, the world of finance and then politics. But I think he can speak about working class communities and the feeling that they have of that sense of abandonment in a way that not many leading politicians across the West can, certainly not with any degree of authenticity. And I think he went before the senior political and military figures in Munich, and he told them, as we say in Britain, he told them a few home truths. He told them some things that were, I had no doubt, very uncomfortable for them, but things that they almost certainly needed to hear, whether they knew it or whether they didn't. He talked about the erosion of freedom of expression and freedom of conscience across large parts of the West, particularly Europe. He talked about what you might call cancel culture, how people were being arrested for activities that really ought not to constitute crimes. He talks about the undermining of democracy across the West, how we like to preach about being great Democrats, but we're quite selective about how we uphold democracy. He talks about the general election result in Romania, which was scrubbed from the record on some pretext because a national populist happened to win. He talks about Brexit and the reasons that people voted for it. And he talks about, what we, to use an English phrase, the elephant in the room, which was the whole issue of immigration. Which I think has caused a huge backlash across the West among ordinary voters, simply because of the pace and scale of it and the fact that it's been managed dreadfully and people have not been listened to. So for that alone, I think he deserves credit, because he went into a room of global leaders and told them things that they really needed to hear. And I think whatever other shortcomings he has, and he clearly does have some, as all politicians do, he deserves praise for that.
And you were mentioning some of these things, but one thing he says in his speech is, "What are we defending?" And you were, of course, mentioning that as well. He was referring to hypocrisies he sees within the EU. Could you elaborate more on these hypocrisies, and are the European establishment undermining certain things, and why is it so?
Well, I think they certainly are, and I think the problem is that if you like, the European liberal elites and more widely the elites across the West have just become so used to having things go their way for so long. They dominated the agenda. Their thinking, their ideology was embedded throughout our political institutions, our cultural institutions, and even when people voted against what it was that they stood for. So, for example, Brexit being probably one of the best examples. they still, in many cases, didn't listen. It was an arrogance born, as I say, from just becoming accustomed to having their way for so long. And I think what that has done is that's created a chasm, if you like, between those ruling elites and between so many millions of ordinary voters on the other hand. Those voters think that the political establishments in their respective countries and more widely, as I say, across Europe and the West, just simply don't listen to them. And those elites just think that the voters keep getting it wrong. And if only we shout at the voters a bit more, and if only we keep trying to re-educate them, they really will come round to the ideas of, you know, what you might call this militant cosmopolitan liberalism, this institutional progressivism that has taken hold at the top of our society, across our societies across the West. The truth is the voters are not coming round to those ideas. They're not coming round to that ideology because they do actually value the things that the elites don't seem to care that very much about. They do value things like national identity. They do understand the importance of strong borders. They're not completely sold on the idea of enforced multiculturalism, which seems to have fragmented our societies across the West and actively promotes separateness and difference between different peoples. They want, on the one hand, economic justice and economic security, and they haven't had much of that over the last 20 years. But on the other hand, they want a degree of cultural security as well. And that sense that they have, that sense of place, that sense of belonging, that sense of rootedness, which, thanks to globalization and the ideas of the liberal political class, has just been, those things have just been violated. You know, they've experienced deindustrialization on a huge scale. They've experienced rapid demographic change, and all of these things have made working class communities uneasy and unsettled. That's something that JD Vance clearly grasps. You don't have to agree with him on everything to realise that he grasps that important point. And it was right, I think, that he made that point to those global leaders.
Would you say that the European politicians have a right to be angry at the speech? Or is it because they just can't swallow it?
Well, they've got a right to be angry. Whether or not they should be angry, I think is a different question. I mean, a number of them clearly were angry at it. I think some of them were pretty shocked by it. But I think that in itself, I think, proves the point that they do live in something of a bubble. That they mix in their own particular circles, and that in doing so they just reinforce their own ideology amongst themselves, and that really just widens the chasm between those particular elites and ordinary voters. So when someone comes along and doesn't play the game and says, actually, no, you've got this wrong, you know, your sunlit uplands of cosmopolitan liberalism, which you were trying to lead the masses to, it's not a place particularly where the masses want to go to. And this is why the masses keep rebelling against you. And this is why, for example, the centre-left has collapsed across Europe, Britain being the exception at the moment, but there are particular reasons for that, maybe. They weren't used to that. They're not used to someone speaking to them directly and highlighting their faults in that way. And unless they grasp the truth in what he's saying, then I fear that disconnect between so much of the European establishment and ordinary voters is just going to increase the reaction in some of these countries and increase national populism. National populism is surging in a number of countries across Europe for exactly the reasons that I've said. And as much as the liberal class will try to keep a lid on it, they are failing to do it. And I think politics is only going one way across much of Europe. So they really need to understand that.
Why do you think he chose to make this speech at this particular time and place?
Well, I guess it presented the first major opportunity to say what he felt he needed to say to some of the global leaders. And he, probably wanted to do that as quickly as possible to put down a marker and to explain where he sees the Trump administration going ideologically. And it's not very often you get so many global leaders, politicians, security personnel, military people, technocrats, and so on, in a room together, people with so much power. So when that opportunity comes along, it's one I think you had to take, and he decided to take it. And I stress again, as I said at the beginning, I'm sure if I sat down with JD Vance, I would find many, many differences with him politically and economically. He's on a different wing of politics to me. But that doesn't mean you can't understand that from time to time someone has hit on an important truth and has shown the courage for speaking that truth to those who needed to hear it. And that person deserves praise for doing that.
And once the hype dies down around this speech, how significant will it be? Will it mean anything for Europe's future? Will it amount to anything more than the controversy that we see now?
Well, as I said, centre-left parties across Europe are being beaten heavily. What we've seen is the emergence of what you might call national populist parties and politicians who have begun to do really well in the polls. You look at AfD in Germany, probably being the clearest example at the moment. You look at the Front National, or National Rally as they're now called, in France. You look at the Netherlands, you look at Austria, you look at Italy, you look at the surge of Reform UK in the UK. Reform are now leading most of the opinion polls in the UK. Now, some people would say, well, that's taking us back to the dark ages of the 1930s, and this is how fascism started. All of that is nonsense, actually. All of that is nonsense. What we are seeing is a reaction from millions of pretty decent, tolerant and moderate voters, in most cases, who have just become sick and tired and demoralised with the way the elites in their countries have just ignored them over some of the fundamental issues. For example, immigration. And when you combine that with the economic insecurity that they're experiencing, they're just looking for something very different. They are looking for people to defend their way of life, to defend their culture, not in a way that is hostile or intolerant to others, but just simply says, look, we have a sense of place and we have a sense of belonging. And these things, as I said before, are being violated. No one within the liberal establishments within our country seems to be listening to that, or they pay lip service to it, but never really address it. And some of us have been writing about this phenomenon for quite a few years and have seen it coming, and have been warning our own parties, the Labour Party in the UK, in my case, to take heed of it, because it's only going to grow. And that's exactly what's been happening, and it's not going to go away anytime soon.
Thank you very much, Paul Embery, trade unionist, writer and political commentator, for your insights today.
Pleasure.
And thank you for watching Riks Europe.